It was me who pestered Henry persistently until we got together. On the day of graduation, I went to find him joyfully, only to see him kissing the class beauty in the corridor. Only then did I realize that the person he had loved all these years had never been me. Having a second chance at life, I no longer pestered my childhood sweetheart, but he wouldn't let it go. He pinned me firmly against the wall, his eyes red as he said, "You said you'd never leave me." Looking at the 62-day countdown to the exam on the blackboard, I was lost in thought. The teacher on the podium was passionately explaining the test paper questions. I turned my head and saw that Henry was still sound asleep, and Rose, sitting diagonally opposite him, was quietly taking out a mirror and applying lipstick. I couldn't help but snort coldly. Those two scoundrels were truly a match made in heaven. I had been with Henry for 6 years and had been obedient to him in every way. After graduation, I thought we were finally going to achieve a happy ending. When I went to find him, I witnessed him kissing the class beauty Rose in the corridor with my own eyes. During those 6 years, he had been ambiguous with Rose many times, but I had endured it all. But now I had come to my senses. Well, not completely though. Feeling disheartened, I went up to the rooftop of the hospital, intending to jump off. However, I ran into an old classmate. Not wanting anyone to see me in such a wretched state, I changed my location. I jumped into the river instead. I should have been in the underworld, but now I was sitting in the classroom. I never expected that I would be reincarnated. This time, I didn't regard Henry as anything special anymore, because I accidentally met someone else. I fell in love with Ethan at first sight 6 years later. When the class was finally over, I walked around to the back door, which was closer to the toilet. Then I strolled leisurely towards the front door, my eyes fixed on the seat in the first row. No matter when it was, Ethan was always buried in doing exercises with great concentration. His slender fingers held the pen firmly, the veins on the back of his hands were clearly visible, and the tip of the pen rubbed against the paper neatly. He seemed to sense something. His pen paused for a moment, and he raised his head slightly. His eyes met mine unexpectedly. Just for a second, and then he lowered his head again. After coming back from the toilet, I entered through the front door again. Obviously, I was trying to make my presence felt in front of him. Ethan was a bookworm, with only studies in his eyes, and he seldom talked. If it weren't for the fact that I was often criticized by the head teacher for being with Henry, I'm afraid he wouldn't even know my name. Ethan had always been the top student in our class. The best way to get close to him was to ask him questions about the exercises. I picked 2 difficult questions and went to ask him. I walked cautiously to the table. "Ethan, could you teach me how to do this question?" "I don't know how." Ethan was a bit taken aback. He was like a log rooted to his seat. Hearing my voice, he just stared blankly at the test paper and didn't look up. "Well, if it's inconvenient for you, I can ask someone else." With that, I was about to take the test paper back. Finally, Ethan raised his hand and pinched a corner of the test paper. He pushed up his bulky black-framed glasses and looked up, his expression a bit unnatural. "It's okay. I'll teach you." Ethan patiently explained the questions to me. His voice was so gentle that it tugged at my heartstrings. Why was I so blind before? I gave up the gentle and kind Ethan and chose the arrogant and conceited scoundrel Henry instead. Just these hands of his were 100 times more beautiful than Henry's. In my memory, he was dressed in white, leaning casually against the wall with his slender waist, his long and thin fingertips holding a cigarette. Against the light, he took a deep puff. "Alice, Alice? Do you understand?" A hand waved in front of my eyes, bringing me back to my senses. Just as I was about to bite the bullet and say that I understood, a dark shadow loomed over me. It was Henry. "Hey, Alice. I know you're jealous." Why should I be jealous? It was so absurd. He was not only arrogant but also narcissistic. I was really speechless. I didn't want to pay attention to him, but I didn't want to move either, because I still had one question left to ask. Ethan and I exchanged a glance without showing any emotion. Ethan returned the test paper to me first. "I'll teach you next time when there's a chance." I had no choice but to leave reluctantly. When I left, I stepped hard on Henry's foot to vent my anger. Henry let out a loud cry and called me a lunatic. When did you become so fond of studying? Henry limped after me back to our seats. I saw Rose's jealous look from a distance. Then she pretended to fall down among the desks, attracting the attention of our classmates. Huh! She had never bothered to hide her true feelings in front of me. It was such a blatant provocation. Henry turned his head to look over there, with a very worried expression on his face. Go ahead. I told Henry to go. Perhaps it was the first time I had been so generous. Because in the past, I would surely have grabbed Henry's arm and not let him go. Henry stood there, stunned, staring at me coldly. As if he cared about me a lot. Resting my face on one hand and holding a pen in the other, I stared fixedly at the back of Ethan's head. Recalling the last life, the only interaction I had with Ethan was at the class reunion after graduating from high school. At that time, I had already successfully confessed my love to Henry. Whenever someone persuaded me to drink, Henry would fulfill his duty as a boyfriend and drink up for me. At that time, everyone at the party was teasing us, saying that we, as a young couple, were so clingy. In the private room, Henry and I were cuddling with each other, while Ethan sat at the far end of the sofa without saying a word. He just drank in silence. At that time, I happened to glance at him and was surprised to find that Ethan was really good at drinking. Halfway through the party, he stood up and said that his family didn't allow him to stay out too late and left first. He didn't care that our classmates were making fun of him with words like model student behind him. When Henry sent me home, it was already midnight. I just washed up and went to bed. When I woke up the next day and opened my phone, I found that Ethan had sent me a WeChat message at 1 o'clock in the morning. There was only one word, "Are you there?" Someone who had never taken the initiative to talk to me or contact me before sent a message in the middle of the night. There must be something important. However, after I asked him, he said it was nothing and never replied to me again. At that time, I thought it was so strange. Now that I thought about it, could it be that he liked me? Seizing the opportunity, I went to ask Ethan questions again. After asking questions for nearly half a month, we had become quite familiar with each other. After Ethan finished explaining the last point, I suddenly pulled back the pen that was in his hand. Ethan looked at me in confusion. Ethan, do you smoke? I was really curious because he was so skillful at smoking on the rooftop back then. He was shocked. His pupils dilated a bit. It seemed that he didn't expect me to ask such a question. He shook his head. No. It's bad for health. Huh? It's a bit early to boast. Unfortunately, in the not-too-distant future, you'll become a heavy smoker. After thinking for a while, I changed my question. Well, if you learn to smoke in the future, what do you think the reason would be? Ethan scratched the back of his head. It should be because of something unhappy, to numb myself. Something unhappy? Indeed. Although I was extremely sad at that time, just from that brief glance, I could tell that he was very lonely then. I thanked Ethan and then went back to my seat. Henry came in through the back door and walked up to me with bread and milk in his hands. I thought he had bought them for me and was just about to refuse when I realized I was being overly sentimental. Rose hurt her foot and didn't have breakfast. She asked me to buy these for her. Don't get me wrong. I almost rolled my eyes. Why did he have to tell me that? I really wanted to say that if he liked to play the role of a knight in shining armor for her, then just go ahead. There was no need to pretend. I casually waved my hand at him, telling him to leave quickly. I didn't even want to say one more word to him. Whenever I saw the two of them standing together, I would remember how they were kissing passionately in the corridor back then. It was disgusting. And annoying too. Now that I didn't pester him anymore, he started to pester me instead. Every big break, I would go to Ethan to ask questions. One day, just as I arrived at Ethan's desk, Henry grabbed my wrist. He frowned, looking quite angry. Come out with me for a moment. I didn't understand what I had done to offend him. I tried hard to shake off his hand. But I couldn't. My anger flared up instantly. Are you crazy, Henry? I didn't want to lose my temper in front of Ethan at all. After all, my expression would look fierce and ugly when I was angry, but I just couldn't bear it anymore. Henry glanced at Ethan contemptuously. Why have you been going to him for study lately? If there's something you don't understand, you can come to me. Could this guy be a bit more self-aware? With his poor grades at the bottom of the class, he had the nerve to say that. Let go. She doesn't want to go with you. Ethan, who had been silent all along, stood up, pressed Henry's arm, and stared at him quietly. Finally, Henry let go of my wrist, but suddenly he pushed Ethan. What's it to you? Caught off guard, Ethan staggered back 2 steps and his lower back hit the desk. One was into sports all day long, while the other wished he could use his sleeping time to do exercises. There was no comparison between their physical conditions at all. Why are you bullying our classmate? I just don't want to go with you. So what? Please don't bother me any more in the future. Henry froze for a moment. His whole face darkened. Unhappily, he pushed his cheek with the tip of his tongue. Fine, very well. Now you won't be able to coax me even if you want to. Goodbye. Sitting under the shade of a tree, I handed Ethan the plaster I just bought and a bottle of chocolate milk. Thank you. Ethan reached out to take them, but pulled his back in the process and his expression showed a bit of pain. Henry was really too rough. Let's talk about something happy. Ethan, which university do you want to apply to? I had only heard from others that Ethan went to a very good school, but I didn't know which one it was. University D. So it was University D. Do you want to study medicine, right? Only after I said that did I remember to cover my mouth. My tone seemed a bit too certain. Sure enough, Ethan suddenly turned his head, with an incredulous look in his eyes. How do you know? I felt a bit guilty. I couldn't say that I ran into you in the hospital 6 years later. I guessed. You look like you'd be a good fit to be a doctor. Ethan touched his crew cut, which made him look a bit old-fashioned embarrassedly. Really? Thank you. I want to apply to the same school as you. I quietly looked up at Ethan. His face visibly turned red, and the tips of his ears were covered with a pinkish mist. With me? He seemed not to believe it. It was normal for him not to believe it. I was only ranked 20th in the class in the last midterm exam. Wanting to apply to the same school as the top student was almost like a fantasy. But now I knew the exam questions. Maybe I could make it if I worked hard to catch up on my knowledge. I'll do my best. Believe me. I was quite certain when I said this. The sunlight shone through the gaps between the leaves and directly onto that cheek, which was even fairer than a girl's. Ethan lowered his head, casually drawing circles with a branch. If you listened carefully, you could hear his faint hum. The summer breeze carried the thoughts of the teenagers and drifted into the distance. In order to apply to the same school as Ethan, I studied until 1 o'clock in the morning every day and got up at 6 o'clock to walk to school. Ethan was a boarding student. Every time, he would go to the school store to buy breakfast after the morning self-study. When passing by the breakfast store, I bought breakfast for Ethan and put it in his drawer. As soon as he entered the classroom and sat down, I saw his hand pause when he took out his books. He stood up and looked around the classroom. Finally, he looked at me. I met his gaze openly and smiled knowingly. The tips of his ears turned red again. He was so easily shy. I accidentally found that Ethan was always the last one to leave after the evening self-study. So I shamelessly went to ask him questions again. After he patiently explained them to me, I would always thank him and say that I would still bring him breakfast the next day. No need. No way. This is your reward. Otherwise, I'd be too embarrassed to come and ask questions. All right. In the end, Ethan compromised. Soon came the last monthly exam in Senior 3. The teachers graded the test papers very quickly. This time, I ranked 7th in the class. All the teachers praised me highly. Ethan still firmly held the first place. The teachers praised me so much that I became numb to it. It seemed that Ethan was even happier than I was. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were full of gratification. But there was one person who was very unhappy. Henry passed a note to me, saying that he had something to tell me after the evening self-study. We hadn't spoken to each other for half a month since our last quarrel. After the evening self-study, I was originally going to find Ethan. Henry saw that I was slow to pack my school bag and shouted at me in the classroom. Meeting his resentful eyes, I had no choice but to take my things and follow him. Before leaving the classroom, Ethan was still seriously doing exercises. Forget it. I folded my arms, stood under the street lamp, and stepped on the small stones under my feet. What is it? Just say it, I said impatiently. Henry put his hands in his pockets and stood in front of me, trying to look cool. You did very well in this exam. Yes. As if I needed you to tell me that. Does our agreement to apply to the same school still count? I had once made an agreement with Henry to go to the same school. Even though I could have gone to a third-tier college after the exam, I gave up that opportunity for him. I resolutely accompanied him to a vocational school. I was so stupid back then, only thinking about being in a relationship with him. But not anymore. Looking at his expectant eyes, my expression slowly turned cold. What you mean? Can't you bear to see me doing well? He suppressed the anger that was about to burst out and took a deep breath. I didn't. I want to ask which school you want to apply to. I want to go with you. Huh? He must be out of his mind. Just you? Why not? Then just try. I turned around neatly, leaving him with my back. Ethan seemed to have become a bit strange. Although he still answered whatever questions I asked. Before, when he explained things to me, his tone was gentle, but now he was more like a question-answering machine. I thought he might be feeling bored or that I was taking up his study time. So I reduced the frequency of going to him to ask questions. Henry suddenly started to study hard, but after just a few days, he began to slack off again. Look, as expected, I still knew him well. After the evening self-study, when I was on my way home and walked out of the school gate, I realized that I had forgotten to take my keys. I ran back to the classroom and found that Ethan was still studying. I originally wanted to say hello, but was afraid of getting a cold shoulder. Just as I was about to leave, Ethan called me. He handed me a notebook. These are all exercises made according to the questions you asked me. You can take it back and have a look. It should be helpful to you. I was shocked. The top student had actually sacrificed his own time to make knowledge points specifically for me. He must like me, I thought. I casually glanced over. Under the cover of the summer school uniform, Ethan's arms seemed to have muscles? Ethan noticed my gaze and gently pulled at his sleeves. I must have been mistaken. Not sure, so I took another look. With a nervous and tense heart, when I reached out to take it, I pressed his palm. Ethan, let's be together after the exam. While I was touched, I encountered a big problem. Ethan was pestered by Rose. At first, when I found that Rose also went to ask questions, I didn't pay much attention. I just thought she was cramming for the exam at the last minute. But it turned out that for a whole week in a row, she went even more frequently than I did and even bought milk tea for Ethan. I immediately felt a sense of crisis. Things definitely weren't that simple. Why did she have to interfere in everything? When I had a good relationship with Henry before, she always tried every means to squeeze in. And then not long after that, I caught her and Henry shopping outside. You know, the more people lack something, the more they want to prove it. At that time, she always deliberately or inadvertently showed off the gifts Henry gave her in front of me, trying to prove that her relationship with Henry was better. Now she was clinging to Ethan again. I suspected that she was targeting me on purpose. I was so angry that I took out my phone and took a picture of her and Ethan and sent it to Henry. I didn't say anything else. The next day, Henry and Rose had a quarrel. Because once when I came back from the toilet by chance, I found the two of them standing in the same corridor, but both were walking close to the wall, as if they were afraid to get close to each other. What was that if not a quarrel? I sneered coldly. Rose never went to ask questions again. And I took the opportunity to rush forward. The exam finally ended. I had a hunch that I did very well in this exam. It was time for the graduation party again. This time, it was different from before. Rose was also present. This time I sat beside Ethan. Ethan was very reserved, just like when he was listening to a class, with his hands on his thighs. I quietly moved my body closer to his. I leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Are you sure you'll apply to University D?" Ethan froze all over and slowly nodded like a robot. "I'm sure." "Then just wait and see." I smiled brightly and smugly. In the dim light, Ethan's face suddenly turned red. People at the wine table had already started to urge to play games. It was the classic game of truth or dare again. Henry was the first one that the wine bottle pointed to. He chose dare. At this time, some people started to cheer and asked him to kiss a girl present. Rose was already blushing and waiting for him. But he stared at me with burning eyes. I immediately felt that something was wrong. With a flash of inspiration, I simply put my arm around Ethan's neck and gave him a kiss. The whole place was in an uproar for a moment. Only I knew how nervous Ethan was. At the moment when I kissed him, Ethan even stopped breathing. I turned around and saw Henry's face turn as dark as a thundercloud, as if he had eaten something unpleasant. Since he had to abide by the rules of the game, he could only go and kiss Rose. I don't know if Rose was drunk or what happened. At the moment when Henry left her lips, she pulled Henry back and gave him a French kiss. Halfway through the kiss, Henry pushed her away suddenly and stood up. The cheers stopped abruptly. Henry came over to pull me. This time I tried my best to avoid him. Suddenly, there was a loud crash and someone fell down, causing a stir. Henry was punched by Ethan. I looked at Ethan's fist with bulging veins and his knuckles were red. He took a step forward and blocked in front of me. When did Ethan's shoulders and back become so broad? Under the white shirt, his thin pectoral and back muscles were faintly visible. Henry was helped up by Rose, who was crying pitifully. He frowned and raised his hand to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth. "If you have something to say, say it here. Don't pull and push around." Ethan's cold tone even startled me. The kid who used to only have studies in his eyes seemed to have really changed. "Why did you just kiss him?" Ignoring Ethan's words, Henry stared at me fixedly and said, "I like him." I took Ethan's hand. "Haha, you like him. Does he like you? Are you so fond of throwing yourself at others?" Henry's words were almost squeezed out through his teeth. Everyone present gasped. I didn't expect that after so many years of relationship with Henry, he would humiliate me like this. Even if there was no love, wasn't there any friendship? Tears gradually blurred my eyes, and a pair of slender hands wiped them away for me. Then Ethan said in a deep voice, "I chased her. And we're already together. Why can't we kiss?" Someone was so excited that they wanted to clap their hands but forcibly held back. In the end, this party ended on a sour note. Before leaving, I passed by Henry and said to him, "You're just used to me following you around and used to me being jealous for you. Think about it yourself." The summer night wind was a bit chilly. I walked home with my arms folded. This time, it was Ethan who sent me home. I. Both of us spoke at the same time, looked at each other, and then lowered our heads simultaneously. Not long after, Ethan spoke first. "Sorry just now. I said we were together in front of them. You didn't say anything wrong. Didn't you agree before?" At that time, when Ethan heard what I said, he was shocked to the core. Slowly, his eyes became red and his body trembled a little. He said yes. I moved closer to Ethan and clenched his somewhat dry palm. "I'm serious. And I was the one who kissed you first. I like you, Ethan. Would you like to be with me?" In both lives, I was the first to confess, but this time I was extremely nervous. Even one more second felt so long to me. What responded to me was a tight hug. "Yeah," he said. Under the moonlight, Ethan held my hand all the way home. Neither too fast nor too slow, I could feel his full cherishing and protection for me. It turned out that this was what it felt like to be treated as something so precious that you were afraid to drop it if you held it in your hands or melt it if you put it in your mouth. My parents went to work early in the morning, and then the doorbell rang. I didn't expect Henry would come to find me so early. "Have you had breakfast?" "I brought you breakfast." He was being nice for no reason. Although I hated Henry to the core, after all, This was the 18-year-old Henry. Henry walked into the living room naturally and sat down on the sofa. Do you have any plans for today? I took a bite of the steamed dumplings and answered him after swallowing it. I'm going on a date with Ethan today. I said it casually, but it really annoyed Henry. He suddenly stood up and clenched his fists. Are you really with him? Yes, of course. Why would I lie? I took another bite of the steamed dumplings and wiped the soup from the corner of my mouth. Who would have thought that Henry suddenly walked over and snatched the soy milk I was drinking from my hand? Yesterday, you told me to think about it. I've thought it through. Finally he was going to admit it. I immediately became serious and signaled him to continue. I've thought it through. I'm going to court you? Are you crazy? The weather was nice today, very suitable for a date. We played several items in the amusement park, but Ethan's face had been gloomy all the time. Not only him, but also me. And also Henry. It was okay that he said he would court me. I didn't expect Henry to be so thick-skinned that he actually followed us on our date. No matter how hard we tried to drive him away, he just wouldn't leave. He stayed about 10 meters away from us and kept watching us all the time. Don't be unhappy. Let's just pretend he doesn't exist. Come on, let's go play the most thrilling roller coaster. I took Ethan's arm and smiled brightly at him. Sure enough, when people do thrilling things, they tend to get nervous, and when they're nervous, they'll forget some unnecessary people. On our way home passing by the shopping mall, Ethan took me to wander around in an optical shop. I'll change my glasses. No way. I glared at him angrily. Absolutely not. Ethan was very puzzled. He brushed aside the hair that had been messed up by the wind. Since the exam ended, Ethan hadn't taken care of his hair. The bangs on his forehead had grown longer, making him look fresh and handsome. If he changed to another pair of glasses, I didn't know how many more fangirls he would have when the new semester of college started. This pair of glasses is a bit heavy, and my prescription has increased. It's a bit inconvenient if I don't change them. Why don't you want me to change them? Why? I couldn't say that the time on the rooftop, Ethan wearing gold-rimmed glasses looked so ascetic, and he directly charmed me to death with a cigarette in his mouth. It was because of that look that I fell in love with him at first sight. But if I didn't let him change them, it would seem that I was being unreasonable. Then you can change them. I lowered my head and said gloomily. Ethan raised his hand and gently rubbed my cheek with a doting tone. Although I don't know why you're unhappy, if you don't want me to do something, then I won't do it. Is that okay? I quickly raised my head. No. You must change them this time. I don't want to be an unreasonable girlfriend. Come on, if you don't change them, you're not my boyfriend. Gee. The mood of a woman in love is really unpredictable. Sure enough, after Ethan had his eyesight checked, he immediately took a liking to a pair of gold-rimmed frames. My heart was trembling. I was about to have my dream lover. On the way home, Ethan was wearing the new glasses, and my heart was pounding. Looking at Ethan's side face, I always thought of him wearing a white coat, with a bit less childishness and looking a bit more mature. Before parting, I hugged Ethan's arm and pouted. I want a kiss. When dating a top student, the progress is always not that fast. We had been together for over a week, but we hadn't kissed yet. Now the time, place, and mood were all just right. Our two faces gradually got closer, and we could feel each other's breath. It was warm and sticky. While kissing, I quietly opened my eyes, and I saw Henry with a gloomy face by the flower bed not far away. In the dim stairwell, Henry pinned me against the wall, and the smell of alcohol on him hit me. So he was waiting for me here. When Ethan and I were having a great time in the amusement park, Henry had disappeared. I didn't expect that he had gone to drink. Let go. I had no expression on my face. Could you please not treat me like this? I like you, Alice. Henry's tone sounded as if he had suffered great grievance. But I hadn't done anything wrong to him. I shook off his hand. Henry, don't you feel disgusted? Disgusted by what? Didn't you just see me kissing Ethan? I don't mind. Well, I do. I pushed him forward. Because Henry had drunk alcohol, he couldn't stand firmly on his feet and directly bumped into the opposite wall. Henry, I didn't expect your bottom line to be so low. You don't mind, but I do. You kissed Rose. In my eyes, you're already dirty. So please stop bothering me. Ethan and I are doing just fine. With this bump, the sensor light in the corridor turned on. What I didn't expect was that Henry was actually crying. Truly, belated affection is cheaper than grass. Henry staggered to his feet and approached me. I'll give you one more chance. Who will you choose, him or me? Henry must have drunk too much. Otherwise, why did I feel that he was even more unreasonable than before? I sneered twice. How ridiculous. You've never been in the options. Okay? I know. I thought he would pester me for a while, but I didn't expect him to compromise so quickly. But that was for the best. I couldn't be happier. Henry left and his back as he walked away looked so lonely. I didn't see him again throughout the whole summer vacation. Later I learned that he had gone abroad. When the first semester of college started, just as I had expected, Ethan attracted a lot of fangirls. Every day, there were people asking Ethan for his WeChat. I, as his girlfriend, was just like a decoration standing beside him. I didn't have any authority at all. Looking at so many pretty girls, I felt a bit inferior. If I hadn't been quick off the mark, I definitely wouldn't have been able to win over such an outstanding guy. So I wanted both his person and his heart. Ethan, breathing heavily, covered me with the quilt. We enjoyed the afterglow together. Suddenly, I turned around to face him, filled with curiosity. Ethan, when did you start to like me? Ethan smiled gently. It seems you're not tired enough. You still have the energy to talk. What? Come on, tell me. Ethan looked at the curtain in the hotel room, as if he was thinking. The expression on his face wasn't happy but rather speechless. Freshman year of high school. Apparently, the feeling of having a secret crush was really hard to bear. Back then, I was always fooling around with Henry and being jealous of Rose. I didn't even notice him at all. I didn't even think of him for an entire semester. I stretched out my arm and hugged him tightly, burying my face in his chest. Never again. You're the only man for me from now on. Alice. Ethan took a deep breath. I made a faint to signal him to continue. Let's do it again. It turns out that men are all the same once they've tasted that kind of thing. When I got back to the dormitory, as usual, I received a WeChat message. It was a picture of the aurora in Iceland. Henry sent me landscape photos day after day. This time, I thought. He was serious. But I had already gotten used to living without him, and I didn't even have him in my sight anymore. My heart was full of Ethan. It was Ethan who made me a better person and let me experience what it was like to be loved. Even on a certain day after the rain, when I thought of all the things in my past life and felt endless regret, as long as I heard Ethan's voice, I would be healed. Ethan was my cure.